Hello everyone, I'm Easy History, and today we embark on a journey through the tumultuous era of the First World War. The roots of this global conflict stretch back to the mid-16th century, when the seeds of capitalism began to sprout across Europe. This burgeoning economic system fueled an insatiable hunger for resources and profits, propelling European nations onto the world stage as colonial powers. With relentless ambition, these nations embarked on campaigns of conquest, seizing vast territories across Asia and Africa, subjugating local populations, and transforming entire continents into colonial possessions designed to enrich the coffers of the metropoles. By the twilight of the 19th century, this imperial scramble had carved up much of the globe, but it also sowed the seeds of bitter rivalry and mounting tension. A significant disparity emerged between the established old guard empires like Great Britain and France, who presided over immense global networks of colonies, and the ambitious newcomers. Nations like the United States, Germany, and Japan were experiencing explosive economic growth and industrialization, rapidly ascending the ranks of global power. Yet, they found themselves comparatively starved of the colonial territories that were seen as crucial markers of prestige and sources of essential raw materials in captive markets. Germany, in particular, felt acutely constrained. By the dawn of the 20th century, the German Empire had surged past Britain and France to become the dominant industrial powerhouse of Europe, second only to the United States globally. Driven by a potent mix of national pride, industrial might, and a militaristic expansionist ideology often described as bellicose, Germany chafed under the existing world order. Seeking to fundamentally reshape the global balance of power and carve out its own place in the sun, Germany forged a powerful alliance with the Austro-Hungarian Empire and, initially, Italy, forming the bloc known as the Central Powers. Their explicit goal: prepare for a war that would forcibly redistribute the world's colonial wealth. Faced with this looming threat and the palpable shift in the European power dynamic, the established empires reacted. Great Britain, abandoning its traditional policy of splendid isolation, entered into a series of crucial agreements, notably with its long-standing rival France, the Entente Cordiale, and with the vast Russian Empire. These understandings solidified into the opposing alliance, the Triple Entente, later known simply as the Allies. Thus, by the early 1910s, Europe was starkly divided into two heavily armed, mutually suspicious military camps. An intense arms race ensued, particularly a naval race between Britain and Germany, as both sides poured resources into military expansion. Convinced that a continent-wide conflict was not a matter of if, but when, the atmosphere was thick with tension, a powder keg awaiting a spark. That fateful spark ignited on the 28th of June, 1914, in the Balkan city of Sarajevo. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife Sophie were assassinated by Gavrilo Princip, a young Bosnian Serb nationalist associated with a shadowy organization known as the Black Hand. The act sent shockwaves across Europe. Austria-Hungary, seeking to exploit the situation to crush Serbian nationalism, which it viewed as a threat to its multi-ethnic empire, blamed the Serbian government for supporting the assassins. Vienna issued an incredibly harsh ultimatum to Serbia, containing demands deliberately crafted to be unacceptable, infringing upon Serbian sovereignty. Serbia, seeking to avoid war but unwilling to completely capitulate, accepted most terms but rejected key provisions. This rejection provided Austria-Hungary with the pretext it craved. On the 28th of July, 1914, exactly 1 month after the assassination, the Austro-Hungarian Empire declared war on Serbia. The intricate web of alliances, designed ostensibly to maintain peace, now acted as a catastrophic transmission belt for war. Within days, the conflict escalated uncontrollably. Russia, seeing itself as the protector of the Slavic Serbs, ordered a general mobilization of its massive army to support Serbia against Austria-Hungary. Germany, bound by treaty to Austria-Hungary, demanded Russia cease mobilization. When Russia refused, Germany declared war on Russia on the 1st of August, 1914. Knowing that war with Russia inevitably meant war with Russia's ally, France, Germany didn't wait. It activated its long-prepared strategy, the Schlieffen Plan, which called for a rapid, decisive knockout blow against France before turning east to confront the slower mobilizing Russian forces. On the 3rd of August, Germany declared war on France. The Schlieffen Plan hinged on speed and surprise, involving a massive flanking maneuver through neutral Belgium and Luxembourg to bypass France's heavily fortified border defenses and encircle Paris. However, the invasion of Belgium, whose neutrality Britain had guaranteed by treaty since 1839, proved a fatal miscalculation. Outraged by the violation of Belgian sovereignty and concerned about German control of Channel ports, Great Britain could no longer stand aside. On the 4th of August, 1914, Britain declared war on Germany, bringing the full might of the British Empire, including its formidable navy and troops from across its global dominions, into the conflict. The European war rapidly metastasized into a global one. In Asia, the Empire of Japan, allied with Britain, saw an opportunity to expand its influence. Eager to seize German colonial possessions in the Pacific and China, Japan declared war on Germany on the 23rd of August, 1914. Further complicating the strategic map, the Ottoman Empire, harboring long-standing rivalries with Russia and courted by Germany, was drawn into the fray. On the 29th of October, 1914, Ottoman warships, nominally under German command, launched a surprise bombardment of Russian Black Sea ports, formally bringing the declining empire into the war on the side of the Central Powers. What began as a Balkan crisis had exploded into a world war, a conflict of unprecedented scale and ferocity, soon dubbed the Great War, and tragically, optimistically, the war to end all wars, due to its sheer, devastating scope. Returning to the Western Front, the initial German advance through Belgium and into northern France was swift and brutal. Belgian resistance, though valiant, was overcome, and German armies swept towards Paris. For a few weeks it seemed the Schlieffen Plan might succeed, potentially deciding the war's outcome quickly. However, the deeper the German forces penetrated into France, the more stretched their supply lines became, and their momentum began to falter. Simultaneously, on the Eastern Front, Russia mobilized and launched offensives into East Prussia and Austrian Galicia, far sooner than German planners had anticipated, as early as the 17th of August. Requiring only weeks, not the predicted 40 days, this unexpected pressure forced the German High Command to divert crucial divisions from the Western Front to bolster defenses in the east. While German forces, under Generals Hindenburg and Ludendorff, inflicted a crushing defeat on the Russians at the Battle of Tannenberg, this diversion critically weakened the Western thrust. Strategically, the early Russian action, though ultimately costly for them, saved France. The weakened German armies were met by a determined Franco-British counteroffensive at the First Battle of the Marne in early September 1914. The miracle of the Marne halted the German advance just short of Paris, forcing them into a strategic retreat. The dream of a quick victory evaporated. Following the Marne, both sides attempted to outflank each other in a series of maneuvers known as the Race to the Sea, extending the battle lines northward towards the English Channel. Subsequent battles, like the First Battle of the Aisne, the 13th of September, -28, 1914, proved incredibly bloody but inconclusive. Neither side could achieve a decisive breakthrough. Exhausted and unable to dislodge each other, the opposing armies began to dig in. Trenches were dug, reinforced with barbed wire, machine gun nests, and artillery positions. By the end of 1914, an unbroken line of trenches stretched some 780 kilometers, nearly 500 miles, from the North Sea coast to the Swiss border, the infamous Western Front. A brutal stalemate of trench warfare commenced, a war of attrition where thousands upon thousands of soldiers would perish in horrific conditions, often fighting desperately over mere yards of shell-blasted mud. Meanwhile, in southeastern Europe, the Austro-Hungarian forces suffered early setbacks against the Serbs, and fared even worse against the Russians. In the Battle of Lemberg, also known as the Battle of Galicia, Russian forces inflicted heavy defeats on the Austrians, capturing vast swathes of territory, including most of Austrian Galicia. By the end of 1914, the initial Austro-Hungarian offensives had largely failed, placing a greater burden on their German ally. Thus, the initial German plan for a swift war, knocking France out quickly, had utterly failed by the close of 1914. Germany found itself locked in a debilitating two-front war, facing the combined industrial and military might of Britain, France, and Russia. Its economic and military potential, while formidable, was arguably less than that of the Entente powers combined. The longer the war dragged on under these conditions, the more precarious Germany's position would become. Recognizing the strategic peril of the prolonged two-front war, the German High Command shifted its focus in 1915. The decision was made to concentrate forces on the Eastern Front, aiming to deliver a decisive blow that would knock Russia out of the war, thereby eliminating one front and freeing up troops for the West. On the Western Front, German forces largely adopted a defensive posture against the Franco-British armies, digging in and consolidating their trench systems. In the East, however, a massive combined German and Austro-Hungarian offensive was launched. This Gorlice-Tarnow offensive proved devastatingly effective. The Russian armies suffered enormous losses, estimated at around 350,000 casualties, and were forced into a massive retreat, known as the Great Retreat of 1915, losing Poland, Lithuania, and parts of Belarus and Ukraine. Despite these stunning tactical victories and the capture of vast territories, Germany failed to achieve its ultimate strategic goal. Russia, though severely battered and suffering immense casualties, did not collapse. Tsar Nicholas II remained determined to fight on. By the end of 1915, the German offensive in the East had run out of steam, hampered by logistical challenges and stiffening Russian resistance. The Eastern Front, too, devolved into a more static, entrenched conflict, albeit on a more fluid line than in the West. Elsewhere, the map of alliances continued to shift. On May 23, 1915, Italy, initially a member of the Triple Alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary, renounced its former partners. Lured by Allied promises of territorial gains at Austria, Hungary's expense primarily Trentino, South Tyrol, and Trieste, Italy declared war on Austria-Hungary, opening a new front in the Alps. However, Italian offensives along the Isonzo River proved incredibly costly and largely futile against well-entrenched Austrian defenders. Later that year, on the 14th of October, 1915, Bulgaria joined the Central Powers, seeking revenge against Serbia for losses in the earlier Balkan Wars, and aiming to gain territory. Attacked from the north by Austro-German forces and from the east by Bulgaria, the Serbian army was overwhelmed and forced into a harrowing retreat through the Albanian mountains during the winter, effectively knocking Serbia out of the war for a time. The year 1915 also witnessed the ill-fated Gallipoli campaign. Spearheaded by Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, the Allies launched a major naval and amphibious assault on the Gallipoli Peninsula in the Ottoman Empire. The strategic goals were ambitious: force the Dardanelles Strait, capture Constantinople, Istanbul, knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war, and open a supply route to Russia. However, the campaign, which lasted from February 1915 to January 1916, was plagued by poor planning, logistical failures, and unexpectedly fierce Ottoman resistance. Expertly commanded in places by Mustafa Kemal, later Ataturk, the Allied forces, primarily British, Australian, and New Zealand troops, Anzacs, suffered heavy casualties and were ultimately forced to withdraw in failure. As the war ground on, both sides desperately sought technological advantages to break the deadlock. 1915 and 1916 saw the introduction and wider use of terrifying new instruments of war. Poison gas was deployed on a large scale, causing horrific casualties and psychological terror. Aircraft, initially used mainly for reconnaissance, increasingly took on combat roles, engaging in aerial dogfights and strategic bombing. Armored vehicles, tanks, made their first appearance, notably used by the British at the Somme in 1916. Though initially clumsy and unreliable, they signaled a future shift in land warfare tactics. These innovations dramatically altered the nature of combat, making the battlefield deadlier and more industrialized than ever before, contributing to the staggering casualty rates and the profound impact on national economies. In 1916, the war reached new peaks of intensity and carnage, defined by two colossal battles of attrition on the Western Front. From February to December, the German army launched a massive offensive against the heavily fortified French city of Verdun. The German strategy, conceived by Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn, was not necessarily to capture Verdun itself, but to bleed France white by forcing the French army into a costly defense of a position of immense symbolic importance. The battle became a horrific meat grinder, with relentless artillery bombardments turning the landscape into a moonscape. French forces, under Marshal Philippe Pétain, famously vowed, "Ils ne passeront pas." They shall not pass. They held Verdun, but at a staggering cost. Combined casualties for both sides approached 700,000 killed and wounded. To relieve the pressure on the French at Verdun, the British and French launched their own major offensive along the Somme River, beginning in July 1916. The first day of the Battle of the Somme remains the bloodiest day in British military history, with nearly 60,000 casualties. Despite repeated, costly assaults, often involving newly introduced tanks, the offensive achieved minimal territorial gains and devolved into another brutal stalemate. By the time the battle petered out in November, combined casualties exceeded 1 million, even surpassing the horrific toll of Verdun. While the Western Front was consumed by Verdun and the Somme, the Eastern Front saw a dramatic, albeit temporary, shift. In June 1916, Russian General Alexei Brusilov launched a major offensive against Austro-Hungarian lines in Galicia. The Brusilov Offensive achieved stunning initial success, shattering Austrian defenses, taking hundreds of thousands of prisoners, and advancing deep into enemy territory. It inflicted a crippling blow on the Austro-Hungarian army, from which it arguably never fully recovered, leaving it increasingly dependent on German support. Over 1.3 million Central Powers troops were killed, wounded, or captured. Russian forces reclaimed significant parts of Ukraine and Belarus. However, the offensive came at a huge cost to Russia as well. German reinforcements were rushed from the west to stabilize the front, eventually halting the Russian advance. Logistical shortcomings and massive casualties prevented the Russians from exploiting their breakthrough fully, or eliminating Austria-Hungary from the war. By late 1916, the Eastern Front again settled into a form of exhausted stalemate. The colossal battles of 1916, Verdun, Somme, Brusilov Offensive, failed to deliver a decisive victory for either side. Instead, they bled the belligerent nations' white, exhausting manpower reserves and straining economies to the breaking point. By the end of the year, the strategic initiative began to slip from the Central Powers, who were increasingly forced onto the defensive across multiple fronts. War weariness intensified across Europe. The immense strain of the war proved unbearable for the Russian Empire. Economic hardship, staggering military losses, estimated in the millions, food shortages, and widespread discontent with the autocratic Tsarist regime fueled revolutionary fervor. In February 1917, March according to the Gregorian calendar used in the West, popular uprisings in Petrograd, St. Petersburg, forced Tsar Nicholas II to abdicate. A provisional government, largely composed of liberals and moderate socialists, came to power. However, crucially, this new government decided to continue Russia's involvement in the war alongside the Allies, a decision that proved deeply unpopular with the war-weary population and soldiers. Meanwhile, Germany made another fateful strategic gamble. Seeking to break the deadlock and strangle Britain's vital maritime supply lines, Germany announced the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare in early 1917. This meant German U-boats would sink any ship, including those of neutral nations like the United States, found in the war zone around Britain without warning. German U-boats with impressive range, up to 9,000 miles, and stealth, initially inflicted devastating losses on Allied and neutral shipping. Britain, heavily reliant on imports, faced a severe crisis. Food shortages loomed, and the specter of defeat seemed possible. However, this policy directly antagonized the United States. The United States had initially maintained a policy of neutrality, though its economic ties and sympathies increasingly lay with the Allies. President Woodrow Wilson won re-election in 1916 partly on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." However, German submarine attacks on American ships, coupled with outrage over incidents like the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, though tensions had temporarily eased after that, strained relations. The final straw came in early 1917, with the interception and publication of the Zimmermann telegram. This coded message from German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann to the German ambassador in Mexico proposed a military alliance between Germany and Mexico should the U.S. enter the war. Germany promised Mexico financial support and help in recovering lost territories, Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. The revelation of this audacious proposal ignited American public opinion against Germany. Citing German violations of freedom of the seas and the direct threat posed by the Zimmermann telegram, President Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war. On the 2nd of April, 1917, the United States officially declared war on Germany, fundamentally altering the strategic balance of the conflict. Although it would take time for American troops, known as doughboys, to arrive in large numbers, the U.S. entry brought vast industrial resources, financial power, and fresh manpower to the beleaguered Allied cause. Despite the U.S. entry, 1917 remained a difficult year for the Allies on the battlefield. Major offensives, like the French Nivelle Offensive, failed disastrously with enormous casualties, leading to widespread mutinies within the French army. Though suppressed, these mutinies reflected the deep exhaustion and despair gripping the soldiers. Austria-Hungary, increasingly weakened and internally fractured, secretly explored peace possibilities, but Allied demands, particularly from Italy and Russia, initially, made negotiations impossible. On the Italian front, a combined Austro-German offensive at Caporetto in late 1917 resulted in a catastrophic defeat for the Italian army, which was pushed back deep into its own territory before stabilizing with British and French reinforcements along the Piave River. Italy was effectively knocked out of offensive operations for a significant period. The most dramatic event of late 1917 occurred in Russia. The provisional government's failure to end the war or solve the country's deep social and economic problems led to its downfall. In October 1917, November by the Gregorian calendar, the Bolshevik Party, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power in the October Revolution. The Bolsheviks promised peace, land, and bread. True to their word, one of their first acts was to seek an armistice with the Central Powers. While the Bolsheviks consolidated control, the Russian army effectively disintegrated, soldiers deserted en masse, and discipline collapsed. German forces exploited this chaos, advancing deep into Russian territory with little resistance. On the 3rd of March, 1918, the Bolshevik government signed the punitive Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany and its allies. Russia ceded vast territories, including Finland, the Baltic states, Poland, Ukraine, and Belarus, representing enormous losses in population, industry, and agriculture. Russia was officially out of the war. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was a major strategic victory for Germany. The collapse of the Eastern Front freed up nearly 1 million German soldiers who could now be transferred to the Western Front. German commanders, led by Erich Ludendorff, knew they had a limited window of opportunity to achieve victory before the full weight of American military power could be brought to bear in Europe. In the spring of 1918, Ludendorff launched a series of massive offensives, the Kaiserschlacht, or Spring Offensives, aiming to break the Allied lines and win the war. These offensives, utilizing new stormtrooper infiltration tactics, initially achieved significant breakthroughs, pushing the Allies back further than at any point since 1914. Panic gripped Paris once more as German artillery shelled the city. However, the German gains came at a tremendous cost in casualties, particularly among their elite stormtroopers. Allied lines, though bent, did not break, and fresh American troops were now arriving in increasing numbers, eventually totaling over 2 million, bolstering Allied morale and manpower. By July 1918, the German offensives had stalled, their momentum exhausted. The tide began to turn decisively. Starting with a successful counterattack at the Second Battle of the Marne in July 1918, where French forces supported by hundreds of tanks broke German lines, the Allies launched a coordinated series of counteroffensives known as the 100 Days Offensive. On the 8th of August, 1918, described by Ludendorff as the Black Day of the German Army, a combined British, Australian, and Canadian force, spearheaded by tanks, shattered German lines near Amiens. Subsequent Allied victories followed at Saint-Mihiel, a major American-led operation, and in the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, the largest American battle of the war. Allied forces relentlessly pushed the Germans back across France and Belgium. Simultaneously, Germany's allies began to collapse. Allied forces advanced on the Balkan front, forcing Bulgaria to sue for peace and sign an armistice on the 29th of September, 1918. Shortly after, Ottoman forces suffered decisive defeats in the Middle East, Palestine, and Syria, leading the Ottoman Empire to sign the Armistice of Mudros on the 30th of October. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, racked by internal dissent and military defeat, notably at the Battle of Vittorio Veneto against Italy, disintegrated, signing the Armistice of Villa Giusti on the 3rd of November. Germany now stood alone, its army retreating on the Western Front, its population suffering from severe shortages caused by the Allied naval blockade, and its home front collapsing. Facing military defeat abroad and revolution at home, sparked by a naval mutiny in Kiel that spread across the country, the German leadership crumbled. A new, more liberal government was formed in early October, which attempted to negotiate peace with President Wilson based on his 14 points. However, Wilson demanded democratic reforms and ultimately insisted on dealing with representatives of the German people, not the old imperial regime. On the 9th of November, 1918, revolution broke out in Berlin. Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. A German republic was proclaimed. 2 days later, on the 11th of November, 1918, at 11 a.m., in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne, the German delegation signed the armistice, effectively ending the fighting on the Western Front. The Great War was over. The aftermath of the First World War was profound and devastating. The conflict inflicted catastrophic human losses. Approximately 10 million soldiers were killed, and over 20 million more were wounded, many maimed for life. Civilian deaths, due to war-related causes like famine and disease, added millions more to the toll. Entire generations were decimated. This suffering extended across the globe, including to colonial territories like Vietnam, then under French rule. Tens of thousands of Vietnamese young men were conscripted into the French army, sent to fight and die on distant European battlefields, particularly the blood-soaked trenches of the Western Front in the Middle East. Reports indicate over 30,000 Vietnamese died and 60,000 were wounded fighting for France, while the Vietnamese population at home endured increased taxes and resource extraction to fund the French war effort. The economic consequences for Europe were ruinous. Vast swathes of territory lay devastated, cities and villages reduced to rubble, infrastructure destroyed. The total financial cost of the war was astronomical, estimated at around $85 billion, an immense sum at the time. European nations, once the world's creditors, emerged deeply indebted, primarily to the United States. The U.S., conversely, benefited enormously from the war. Having entered late and suffering fewer relative losses, its industries boomed supplying the Allies, and it transitioned from a debtor to the world's leading creditor nation. Its GDP doubled, and foreign investments quadrupled. Japan also profited, seizing German territories in Asia and the Pacific, and enhancing its regional dominance. The political map of Europe was fundamentally redrawn. The war led to the collapse of four great empires: the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire. The dissolution of the sprawling Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires resulted in the creation of a host of new nation-states in Central and Eastern Europe and the Middle East, such as Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Poland, Austria, Hungary, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, often based on the principle of national self-determination, though this frequently created new ethnic tensions. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, formally ended the war with Germany. It imposed harsh terms. Germany was forced to accept sole responsibility for the war War Guilt Clause, pay massive reparations, cede significant territory, including Alsace-Lorraine back to France and areas to Poland, creating the Polish Corridor, drastically reduce its military, and relinquish its colonies. Similar treaties were imposed on the other defeated Central Powers. The war also unleashed powerful ideological forces. The success of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia established the world's first communist state, the Soviet Union. The USSR's anti-colonial, anti-capitalist stance deeply alarmed Western powers, creating mutual suspicion and hostility that would shape international relations throughout the 20th century. Simultaneously, the bitterness of defeat, economic instability, and wounded national pride in countries like Italy and Germany created fertile ground for the rise of aggressive, ultra-nationalist ideologies: fascism in Italy under Mussolini, and Nazism in Germany under Hitler. The post-war European landscape was thus fractured not only geographically, but also ideologically, divided between communist, fascist, and democratic capitalist states, setting the stage for future conflict. In an attempt to prevent such a catastrophe from happening again, the League of Nations was established, an international organization aimed at promoting collective security and resolving disputes peacefully. However, hampered by the absence of key powers like the United States, which refused to join, and its lack of enforcement mechanisms, the League ultimately proved ineffective. Despite widespread pacifist movements and a global desire for peace, the unresolved tensions, economic hardships, and ideological clashes stemming from World War I laid the groundwork for another, even more devastating global conflict, just 2 decades later. In truth, no European nation truly emerged victorious from the Great War. All suffered grievously in terms of human life and economic stability, forever changing the continent and the world.